Let's run through the original 1910 Constitution and note just some of the particularly interesting and important parts of it. Article 1 describes the state boundaries. An interesting footnote is that modern-day Las Vegas, Nevada was originally part of Arizona territory. But Nevada was already a state and had the political clout to get that land transferred to them.
So Las Vegas, there would have been no Las Vegas as we know it today because there might have been another Las Vegas, but it would have been somewhere else. But it wouldn't have been called Las Vegas either.
Article 2 is called the Declaration of Rights, which first notes that Arizona must have a representative form of government and that the U.S. Constitution is supreme. After that, it includes the basic things covered by the U.S. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and numerous other things. Remember that the Arizona Constitution was written more than 100 years after the U.S. Constitution. Included, of course, is due process of law from the 5th and the 14th Amendments. The right to petition and of assembly, part of the First Amendment. Here's one that is interesting. Quote, every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, in quotes. That's in the Arizona Constitution. Yeah, that's from also the U.S. First Amendment, but Arizona adds the phrase, quote, being responsible for the abuse of that right, end quote. This gives recognition and authority to the laws on libel and slander. And here's another interesting difference between the Arizona and the U.S. Fourth Amendment regarding search and seizure. We've heard people argue that the U.S. Constitution never specifically mentions the word private or privacy. Arizona does. Quote, no person shall be disturbed in his private affairs or his home invaded without authority of law, end quote. Arizona Article 2, Section 10 protects against self-incrimination and double jeopardy. 11 guarantees a speedy trial. And hearkening back to the days of British history, Section 18 declares that there will be no debtors' prisons. Consistent with the U.S. Constitution, it says the military shall be under control of civilian power, and all elections shall be free. Trials by jury are guaranteed, as is the right to post bail. Here's an interesting one. Like the U.S. Constitution, the state constitution outlaws treason against the state of Arizona. I'm just not sure what would constitute treason against Arizona. Now, a couple of things consistent with the federal system. Arizona cannot confer royal titles and privileges. And over in the criminal justice system, if charged with a crime, the first step in the process must be to appear before a magistrate, that means a judge, for a preliminary examination or preliminary hearing to hear the charge and enter a plea. But here's one that has demanded particular attention in recent decades. Section 31, quote, no law shall be enacted in this state limiting the amount of damages to be recovered for causing the death or injury of any person, end quote. Today this issue is called tort liability. A tort is when someone is injured or killed due to the negligence of another person. The person or their family can sue the alleged guilty party for money damages. Section 31 says that the amount of money to be paid is up to a jury, and no law may limit the amount of monies a jury can award. This provision was meant to protect injured or killed workers. It was part of the progressive and populist movement who viewed the employers, big business, the mines, and railroads, as the bad guys. The U.S. Constitution makes no mention of this issue at all. Article 3 of the Arizona Constitution is pretty simple. It's only one long sentence that says there will be 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and judicial. Article 4 outlines Arizona's legislature. The provision is in 2 parts, and the first deals with what are called initiative and referendum. Initiative is a system wherein the citizens can circulate and sign petitions to put a proposed new law on the ballot for a vote at the general election. They, rather than the legislature, are initiating a new law. Referendum is when the members of the legislature don't want to enact a new law themselves, but refer it to a public vote to let the people decide. Initiative and referendum provisions came out of the populist movement starting around 1890 and intended to give the public a bigger say in government. A look at this U.S. map indicates that most states with this approach are in the West, where the progressive and populist movements were strong. Here, a century later, there are concerns that the initiative process is often abused.
You know, one of the things I think that has caused people to be concerned about the initiative process was it was intended as a way for the people to express their view. And in recent years, the last decade or so, initiatives tend to be funded by special interest groups or individuals with a fair amount of money. And so I think the question is whether the initiative process still represents, as it was intended to, the voice of the people and a direct democracy. I think there are substantial questions that we have to at least be willing to consider there.
Part 2 of Article 4 outlines the structure and operation of the legislature, and it's all very similar to how the U.S. Constitution outlines the U.S. Congress. Of course, there would be a House and a Senate. Now, in those days, the number of elected members was apportioned based on the population within counties. And it might surprise you to know that in the first election, the place with the biggest population and that got the most representatives wasn't Phoenix or Tucson. It was Bisbee, down in Cochise County, where the mining industry was booming. House and Senate members were elected for 2-year terms, and they still are. The governor and higher offices back then also had 2-year terms, but these days they get 4. The legislature was to meet every year in January. They were paid, I believe, $7 per day, which for 1912 wasn't bad. The downside was that the pay ran out after 60 days. Oh, they could stay in session longer if they wanted to, but it was on their own dime. By the way, the fact that state legislative sessions around the country typically begin in January has nothing to do with starting the calendar year off right. Rather, it was that a high percentage of American state legislators were farmers and ranchers. In January and February, the farm fields were covered with snow. It was a good time to be down at the state capitol. The idea was to have the state's business done by March or April, then get back home for plowing and planting or the spring roundup. But back to the Constitution. The legislature could not vote itself a pay raise during their current term in office. Today, pay raises are recommended by a special commission and have to be approved by the voters at the next election. Historically, the voters never approve such salary increases. A person may not serve in the legislature at the same time as serving in some other office. For example, you could not be a state senator and a U.S. congressman at the same time. There were few exceptions. You could be a notary public or on a school board while serving in the legislature. A representative or senator during the legislative session cannot be arrested except on a charge of treason or a felony like robbing a bank or something, or breach of the peace, which might include starting a brawl in a bar. But for minor charges, they have immunity. I remember in the 1970s, a state legislator during the session was pulled over for drunk driving. This was on Central Avenue in Phoenix. In a slurred voice, I imagine, she protested to the police officer, "You can't arrest me, I have legislative immunity." And she was absolutely correct. They did not arrest her. What the cops unofficially did do, however, was to make sure that the incident was reported in all the newspapers. And of course, she was defeated at the next election. As I think we've noted already, the Arizona Constitution, even the original version of 100 years ago, is significantly longer than the U.S. Constitution. And the main reason is that states tend to go into great detail about creation of departments, rules, regulations, etc. So we'll wrap this up with a quick run-through, in no particular order, of some other pieces of our original Constitution. And remember that many things were required by the Enabling Act. For example, we had to create a public school system. It could have no ties to organized religion, and classes had to be taught in English. We had to create a system of courts. The expenses of the Supreme Court were paid by the state. Superior courts were funded half by the state and half by the county. Justice of the peace courts were set up. The Court of Appeals did not come along until many, many years later. But something else we did that seems progressive for that time was to establish special judicial rules for handling juveniles. The Constitution, of course, authorized the taxing authority, and they felt compelled to note in the Constitution that taxes had to be paid with money, no chickens or goats. And speaking of tax revenues, there's a provision that the budget indebtedness of the state government shall never exceed $350,000. Yeah, right. They established the Arizona Corporation Commission, which not only certified corporate entities, but also was given the authority to regulate electrical power, the movement of gasoline, natural gas, oil, trains, buses, as well as to regulate telegraph and telephones. There's a provision for a state mine inspector to be elected by the people, which he still is. There was also the election of a state auditor, but those duties now rest with an appointed auditor general. Various sections addressed working people. The 8-hour workday was adopted, but it was only mandatory in the case of government employees. The legislature was directed to enact a workman's compulsory compensation law, now called workers' comp, to help cover expenses of people hurt on the job. Children under age 14 could not be employed during the hours that school was in session. And here's a final one to think about. No child under 16 years of age could be employed in an underground mine. I guess that was considered pretty progressive at the time. Well, keep in mind that all the topics we've covered relate to the original Arizona Constitution, written in 1910 and adopted in 1912. It has been amended about 100 times over the past 100 years. If you've watched this entire documentary series so far, you have dedicated about 4 hours on the history of the U.S. and the Arizona Constitutions. And there's another 2-hour production examining the most historically or constitutionally significant U.S. and Arizona court cases. Now, we've talked at length about why our ancestors, the colonists, decided to break away from England and create the United States of America. But in closing, let's talk briefly about Arizona. I think the big question is, why did people come here at all? The central and southern parts of the state were hot and desolate. In early times, there were warring Indian tribes to contend with. Water was at a premium. Transportation was difficult at best. And of course, there would be no real air conditioning until the 1950s, and for most people, the 1960s. So why did people come? I phoned a number of friends whose families have been here anywhere from 85 years to 135 years, and asked them that question. One fellow said his great-great-grandfather had killed a man in Oregon and figured the law wouldn't come looking for him down here in the desert. That family became very prominent ranchers. 3 friends mentioned tuberculosis and asthma, so we can credit some population growth to the advice of early Eastern physicians. There came hard rock miners who were often Slavic people. There were lumber mill workers up north who were sometimes African Americans. There were cattle people and cotton people, often in from Texas. There were the folks who came and started the citrus industry. In territorial days, there was something called the California backwash. These were folks who had gone to California looking for gold. When they didn't find any, they sort of wandered back toward Arizona and went to work or started a business. Barry Goldwater told me that was part of how his family got here. What did all these people have in common? Well, often they were getting away from something, if nothing more than the locked-in social and political structures that they came to know back where they were from. But far more important, they were looking for something, and that something was opportunity. Our old friend, historian Don Dodera, summed it up best. He said, Arizona was the land of the second chance. There's a lot of truth to that. And our friend Balladeer Dolan Ellis, in one of my earlier shows, said this.
The giant saguaro cactus is capable of going a year and a half without any additional moisture at all. And all of our plants and our animals have learned to do that. And I think that relates to the people who live in Arizona, too. I think an Arizonan is a survivor. Arizona is a person who wasn't quite satisfied where he was living someplace else, and he had the courage to uproot himself and his family, head out to a new city, and be able to cut out a new life for himself. Certain grittiness.
And there was a common pattern to this Arizona migration, a practice that dates back certainly to the earliest days of Ellis Island, and possibly to the colonial period. The dad would come first, alone, find work, find a home, save every dollar he could, then send for the wife, kids, and perhaps other family members. That was certainly my family's story coming to Arizona in 1951, when the state had a few 100,000 people, but more coming every day. Today it's around 6 million. It's been interesting and an honor, really, for me to have grown up here, watched us grow, and to share with you her history and that of our nation. And so we leave you with a final story. In 1866, our second territorial governor, Richard McCormick, brought his 23-year-old bride, Margaret, from her genteel New Jersey home to be Arizona's First Lady. She was the first First Lady to actually live in Arizona. It was planned that Richard and an entourage would tour the territory, visiting every wide spot in the road that had any population at all. They were few and far between, so it required him to travel from Prescott to Tucson to Yuma and back. And the only way to accomplish this was on horseback. Well, of course, Margaret would not be subjected to this torturous journey. Of course, Margaret would, insisted Margaret. How better to give these rugged Arizona pioneers confidence in the future, to let them know that civilization and government had arrived, that we were now officially part of America the Beautiful. How better than for a slip of a girl from New Jersey to meet the challenge. And so she went, bouncing along in the saddle, week after week, 500, 600, 700 miles. And the people extended their welcome and expressed their delight at the discovery that the First Lady was several months pregnant. During the final leg of that horseback tour, Margaret began to experience complications with her pregnancy. They made it back to Prescott, to the so-called Governor's Mansion, a log cabin which stands today at the Charlotte Hall Museum. And there, on April 30, 1867, gave birth to a baby girl who died, as did Margaret McCormick. Again, she was the first of our First Ladies to actually live in the territory, but more deserving of our gratitude, she was that First Lady who gave her life, demonstrating her belief in the future of a rugged place called Arizona. I'm Bill McCune. Take care.